Welcome back. Now that you've been introduced to our first comic playwright, Aristophanes, and also to Old Comedy, we're going to start looking at the background of Athenian history that produced the cultural, societal, and civil background that was needed to produce Old Comedy. We're going to cover the periods of history relatively briefly for the parts that don't pertain directly to the period of Old Comedy itself, which of course is the late 5th century BC, so that would be right in here, the classical period. But I'm going to touch upon those in a couple of additional videos, and then most of our attention is going to be focused on the Peloponnesian War period, which is when Athens, the place where these comedies are being performed, ends up facing off in a really deadly and protracted war against Sparta, its much more militaristic neighbor to its southwest, about 200 miles down. So this is a rather difficult period for Athens, ironically, in which we see the brilliant Old Comedy being produced, especially under our surviving playwright Aristophanes. So appreciating the history in which these comedies are produced is really vital for understanding how it came about that we could have Old Comedy produced at all, but especially how we could have Old Comedy produced that could take on the Athenian demos, the people, and the Athenian democracy directly. So we will do our best to not fill you in with too much detail any more than necessary, but this overview here, as I say, over the next few videos, hopefully relatively brief, should provide you the important information you need to set Old Comedy in its proper context. So first of all, the pivotal date for Athenian history is 800 BC. At this point, Athens had developed out of its much earlier history into what's referred to as a polis, P-O-L-I-S, which is essentially a city-state. We're going to discuss the institution of the city-state in a future video, but for right now it's enough to know that 800 BC is critical because that's when Athens emerges on the scene as a full-fledged polis, or city-state. So the ages we're talking about are pre-archaic, which means before 800 BC, and then archaic, which is 800 to 480 BC, then classical from 480 to 322 BC, and then finally Hellenistic from 322 BC down to 146 BC. And just to give you a brief overview of what distinguishes these before we start talking about these in detail in future videos, pre-archaic refers to the period before the established civilization of Greece with the polis. We're talking about Minoan times, Mycenaean times, when you have the scripts linear A and linear B that you perhaps have heard about in other courses. We also are predating what's referred to as the Dark Age period, which as it turns out is right after the fall of Troy described to us in Greek mythology. So we have about 200 years from about 1100 down to about 900. That's relatively unproductive in ancient Greek history. And then when we finally come down to 800 BC, then everything's getting back into shape again, and Athens is moving forward. So that's pre-archaic. Archaic age is the further development of the polis from 800 down to 480 BC. Athens was originally a kingship. Then Athens was ruled by archons, 9 of them altogether. And then in the very late archaic age, Athens came to be ruled by the democracy that became the forefront of Athenian government in the classical period. In the classical period, we have Athens rising to its greatness of power under its democracy, then suffering a serious setback with Sparta in the Peloponnesian War, then rising to greatness again, not quite as strong as the first time, but still quite strong in the 300s BC, and then ultimately seeing its power wiped out by the onset of the Macedonians under first Philip and then his son Alexander the Great, ushering in the final Hellenistic age, which is much more cosmopolitan and much more dispersed as to where Greek culture, literature, and and civilization lies. Hellenistic does continue to see the production of Athenian comedy, but it's quite different from what we have in Old Comedy. This is the period of New Comedy, and we will see that when we later in the course when we come to our second Greek playwright, Menander. Okay, when we come back to our next videos, we'll talk a bit about these ages in more detail, but this should give you the first introduction you need to get you started. Okay, I'll see you next video for some more detail about Athenian history.